Okay, ladies and gents, and welcome to a feedback episode of Ding, and the quiz is done, which ironically will not have a quiz in it. Let's start off with our traditional Today in History. Today is the 29th of March, and it is also the anniversary of the last American combat troops leaving Vietnam in 1973, 8 years after they first arrived, but actually a lot more than that since the USA first began its involvement in Vietnam. This is all stuff that you're going to cover next year when we start our unit on conflict and tension in Asia. So, this video is giving you feedback on the question that you completed for lesson 2. You did a paragraph answering this question: how convincing is interpretation A about Harold Godwinson's ascension to the English throne in 1066? We're going to do the same as normal. I'll go through some strengths, we'll have a look at some HTIs, which today focus on skill and structure, and some SPAG errors, and then we're going to have a look at an example that I'd like us to go through. So, in terms of our strengths, everyone incorporated quotations into their writing really well. I didn't see any examples of quotations that were just kind of thrown in for the sake of it, and everybody used historical examples and knowledge to support their arguments. But there's a couple of tweaks I want to make to that, which I'll discuss in a second. So, in terms of our HTIs, first of all, and this is the most important one, make sure that your explanation links up to your quotation. So, some people refer to this quotation of the power behind the throne, but then the evidence that they gave didn't match up to it. So some people discussed Harold Godwinson's Novissima Verba claim rather than the power that he had, that even though it wasn't official was there, which would have then supported that quotation. Next thing, we need to hit a balance between knowledge starvation and knowledge vomit. I'm aware of the fact that we shouldn't be endlessly vomiting knowledge onto the page, but at the same time we also need to showcase the examiner that you do know the specific history which supports the quotation that you've given. So the only advice that I can give here is be as specific as possible. If you're talking about the fact that Harold had power in England, refer to the fact that 4 out of the 5 earldoms in England were controlled by either himself or his brothers, rather than just saying he was powerful. And this is one that we're going to have a look at when we look at an example, is that the highest scoring students, the most successful students, won't just focus on their individual quotation, but they'll use that individual quotation as a means of demonstrating the overall themes and arguments of an interpretation, which, as I said, we're going to have a look at on the visualizer in a second. In terms of our SPAC errors, there was just one. We need to make sure we write the past tense. This was 1,000 years ago. It makes no sense for us to be writing in the present. So let's switch over onto our visualizer once I've folded my paper over, so that we can have a look at what I mean by this particular bit of feedback here. So visualizer, there we go. Okay, so this is the interpretation that you were working with. Most of you focused on this quotation here, Harold being the power behind the throne. And in most of your paragraphs you said, well, I know that this is true, I know this is convincing, and here's my evidence that proves that it's right. And that's fine, that's a perfectly acceptable paragraph. But in order to make it even stronger, what we need to do is look at the overall argument. So we just have that up in the corner. The question asks us about the entirety of interpretation A. So it's not just saying, are the different parts of that paragraph or that interpretation convincing? Is the interpretation convincing as a whole? So we need to think about what the overall argument is of this interpretation. And there are a few things that give us a bit of a hint about this. So, unexpectedly seize the moment, plotting, power behind the throne, deal with the consequences. Now, all of these seem to be quite heavily implying this idea that Harold did not have a legitimate, a well-reasoned and supported claim to the throne, but he chose to take the throne anyway. And one of the reasons he chose to take the throne anyway is because he had a lot of power. And so it's really important that our explanations look at the quotation we've chosen, but also look at this overall idea. Harold did not technically have the right, and that was me doing quotation marks, the right to take the throne through routes such as a dynastic claim, but he did have the power that meant that he could either take it if he needed to, or once he had taken it, he had the ability to make sure that other people couldn't take it from him. So let's have a look at a good example in practice so that we can see how we would put this into our paragraphs. One reason why the source is convincing is because it calls Harold Godwinson the power behind the throne. Short, sharp quotation, really well incorporated into the first sentence. The Godwins were the most powerful family in England at the time, with 4 of the 5 earls being Harold Godwinson and his brothers. This means that Harold Godwinson would essentially been ruling England without the title of king. I do agree with that explanation, but I don't think it links back to the overall argument within the interpretation, which is this idea that Harold didn't have a legitimate claim to the throne, but did have the ability to take it anyway. So I would focus on this final sentence, and what I would want to talk about is the importance of these 4 to 5 earldoms in England. 4 earldoms in England in Harold seizing the throne, despite the fact that he doesn't have a legitimate claim. As I mentioned before when we were looking at the interpretation, this ultimately comes down to the fact that with these earldoms, these men have men. They have troops to fight for them. And troops mean power, military power. So with this power behind him, with these men behind him, if Harold were to take the throne through less than legitimate means, he would have the ability to keep hold of it in the long term, even though his claim isn't very legitimate. So that's what this sentence needs to be tweaked to. It needs to reflect the overall argument of the interpretation. Now, couple of side notes. First of all, I am incredibly proud of everybody who has submitted work to me. A couple of you submitted work to me a day or so late. That is absolutely fine. Honestly, I would rather get some work in late than no work at all. However, I have seen a little bit of a drop off in the number of people who are completing the quiz and the number of people who are submitting work. I've also seen some people ticking the done symbol on ePraise and then not actually doing the work. It is really important that you take part in this and you engage with it, because I'm not going to be able to pick this up in September where we left off. We are going to have to move on with America, and that means that if you haven't been fully engaging with these lessons, you're not going to be in a good position to carry on. Also remind you that every Friday I will be running a clinic, so if you have any questions, if you're finding it difficult to engage with the work, if there's anything that I can help with, just pop on the link that I will put up on Friday mornings and you can ask me a question on my live stream, or you can just email me. That is exactly what I'm here for. Okay, so what you should now be doing is you should be, let's flip this round, there we go, you should be taking this feedback. You should be taking into account what I went through with the interpretation and then with this example, and you should be using it to improve your work. Now, whether you do that as a redraft or whether you do it as a tweak is up to you, but it is really important that you go through that process. Okay, thank you very much.